So when I started working on the book, I realized that the last 400 years characterized by periods of relative homogeneity versus periods of quite intense acoustic change. And so I decided to focus obviously on these periods of great change. And I decided to work my way back in time because I wanted to start with the way in which Shakespeare sounds now, because that's what is familiar to contemporary audiences and readers. And then having just said how first and foremost for the contemporary and recent production of Shakespeare in the theatre, I focused on the impact of foreign productions on our sensitivity to sound and how Shakespeare sounds and why that might be. And then I move backwards to the early 20th century when people started to experiment with original pronunciation. And I got really tickled by the fact that normally original pronunciation is associated with exercises in acoustic archaeology, and they're seen as quite conservative because they're believed to be aimed exclusively at recovering the original sound of Shakespearean performance in the early modern period. But actually, original pronunciation was also used by some pioneers, like a BBC radio producer called Mary Hope Allen, to widen audiences, to diversify audiences, to play with the way in which Shakespeare was sounding at the time on stage, which was quite standard and quite sophisticated and well spoken, to introduce a different range of sounds that would make people who would not necessarily go to the theatre interested in Shakespeare. After that period, I moved back in time a bit further back, and I discovered that the single most important period of acoustic change in the years intervening between the kind of Restoration, early 18th century, and the late 19th century, early 20th century was associated with David Garrick. I had not realized before I started researching this book that David Garrick was normally hailed as a reformer in terms of the styles of delivery on stage, because he performed Shakespeare more naturally. This is the Enlightenment, when reason started to prevail over tradition, and the observational nature was valued more than conventions. So Garrick is widely studied in that context. But I wasn't personally aware of the fact that Garrick was also an acoustic reformer, because he had an accent. He grew up in the Midlands, and then he performed Shakespeare throughout his life without losing that accent. And I hadn't realized that he had been harshly criticized for the way he sounded on stage. So the acoustic diversity of his voice, combined with the fact that he started his career in what at the time were called illegitimate theatre in East London, inspired theatre reformers to challenge the monopoly over Shakespearean spoken drama that limited the performance of Shakespeare to 2-3 theatres in the West End in London, to make Shakespeare more widely available. I discovered that two great reformers shared not only the first and second name, so they're both called John Palmer, but they also shared a passion for bringing Shakespeare to more people and more diverse audiences by obtaining licenses for professional actors to play Shakespeare in provincial theatres, and by encouraging non-professional and amateur actors to speak Shakespeare in their own voices. and this group of actors were patronizingly referred to as spouters, and that gives you a sense of the reaction, the negative reaction that the proliferation of spouting Shakespeare in this country caused at the time. Last but not least, I looked at how Shakespeare was spoken in the early modern period, and I tried to decide for myself whether Shakespeare sounded more popular, gutsy, more accessible, as some phoneticians claim, or whether Shakespeare on the early modern stage was actually pronounced in a way that echoed the speech of the cultural elite at the time, of the court at the time. And I came to the conclusion that the actors used a diversity of accents, and that Shakespeare contemporaries were more concerned about the fact that actors could fake accents than how they sounded. The Puritans were just as horrified because Shakespeare's actors were cast and cross-dressed to play female roles, so boys would play female roles. They were just as horrified at the fact that actors did not only look other than they were, but they sounded other than they were, and above the lowly status that was associated with the acting profession at the time. So for them, what was problematic was the ability to switch registers and accents, and to deceptively personate people of a higher social status. And then that led me to just look again at how regional variation is used in Shakespeare. We're very lucky that the original printed text preserves some of the phonetic spelling that was probably used by Shakespeare and his contemporaries to note down the lines spoken by characters who are supposed to use a regional variation. And I came to the conclusion that variation was important, that it was heard and decoded by audiences, because if playwrights used it, it means that they relied on their audiences to be able to hear it and understand the connotations that variation carried at the time.